I've been working on homelessness for about 20 years, and for a long time, does that sound okay? It sounds like I'm getting some feedback coming. Not better? Yes. Okay. For a long time, it was believed that homelessness who became homeless was really determined by a lot of individual factors related to mental health issues and substance use issues or health conditions. And what we realized through a lot of recent research and research over the years was that, in fact, when you looked at community rates of those types of conditions, it didn't really explain rates of homelessness in communities. We see huge variation in the rate of homelessness from a community to a community. So, for example, in Dallas, the rate of homelessness is like 11 per 10,000 people. But in San Francisco, it's like 90 per 10,000 people, or Santa Rosa is like 55 per 10,000 people. And so researchers over time have started to really figure out, what really is the root cause and what explains what we see in the data. And what they've realized is that housing costs and vacancy rates explain rates of homelessness across the country. And that was very, very important for three reasons. One is, when we had diagnosed homelessness as just being a problem of the individual, we miss out on really considering comprehensive solutions to the problem. Second is, it told us that we actually can't really resolve homelessness or prevent more people from becoming homeless unless we solve the affordable housing crisis. And the third thing is that means all communities have a decision to make about then, while we are solving the affordable housing crisis, we have to invest in strategies to rehouse people quickly as new folks are coming into homelessness because of that environment that's making people very vulnerable. So not to say that those individual factors don't heighten risk, but it is that overall context of not really being able to pay for housing costs that then triggers homelessness for people in the community. So. Yes.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Glad to be here. So I come from the architecture, design, and planning community, which is sort of an arm of the private housing delivery ecosystem. And I moved here a little over 20 years ago, straight out of college, because I wanted to find the most car-dependent, sprawling city I possibly could, and also warm weather, and I was able to get both of those things at once. One, because there was an opportunity, right, a job opportunity, but also because the economics and energy of car dependence just doesn't add up. So it's not something that can actually last the test of time, and we're going to continue to see that. And so that's essentially what I was looking for, because I wanted to make a difference. And luckily enough, I joined an architecture firm that was working on the first phases of developments like Addison Circle and Legacy Town Center, which was delivering walkable urban development in the suburbs. And some of that was also happening in the city of Dallas too. But this was 20 plus years ago, where in the local market, multifamily apartments and density were essentially bad words. Nobody delivered them. Had to go elsewhere to get financing, had to improve up the market, all those various things, until people saw what it could be. And then all of a sudden, the investors and developers are like, oh, well, there's actually a premium for that kind of development. That's a good idea. Let's do more of that. Whereas city managers, elected officials, those who are in charge of city budgets say, oh, wow, that really is high performing in terms of a tax base per acre standpoint. That generates more tax revenue for our city. So that's a good thing as well. And also the general market says, I want to live in that kind of situation too, where I can, live above the shop and walk to work or whatnot as well. And so there was a sea change there, where all of a sudden it was like, okay, we want more of that. Fast forward 20 years later, and I gave a talk to the local AIA last year about how over the last 25 years, we actually do urban infill and walkable mixed-use design probably worse than we have over those 25 years. And for a variety of reasons, because that has become essentially a product type rather than a thoughtful design as it originally was. That right now we're basically just skinning an economic equation or a pro forma. It's just delivering as many units as we can, provided things like zoning and financing and all that actually allows us to do so. But there's been a more recent backlash against sort of the big brown boxes or the garage-wrapped apartment that we see as sort of the institutional invested 250 unit buildings that have 1 to 2 parking spaces per every unit, which just drives up rental costs. And so there's been that backlash, and that's why I think there's a really interesting time to have this kind of conversation now going forward, because we can start to sort of lay the groundwork and write what that future vision is of neighborhood revitalization and then the new future of urban infill redevelopment.
So, full transparency, I've not been in this space very long. I joined InnerCity Community Development Corporation in December 21 and was glad to do so, standing on the shoulders of the Honorable Diane Rangel and what she's built. And the thing that, so that is to say, I'm a student of everyone on this stage, and many of you in the audience continue to teach me a lot about this space. But every time I'm, listening to each of you, it reminds me, I was born and raised here in Dallas, and I purchased my first home, I believe I was 24. It's been a minute. I think I was 24 years old. But what occurred to me is how that came about. Some of you, if you've grown up in Dallas, been around Dallas, you remember there used to be an organization called Acorn. Okay. Now, I haven't read all the reports, I know what I've heard, but here's what I know. I was 24 years old, I just had my first child, had a decent job. I grew up in a household, my parents owned a home, and they, if I can say this without offending anybody, they were from the country. I think y'all understand what I mean. So they didn't really show me what it took to buy a home. I grew up in one, and they provided me with a wonderful environment. But when it came time, I knew nothing. I think I stumbled into some Acorn meeting, and this lady asked me, do I like renting an apartment? I was not really. And from there on, she would not leave me alone. I'm serious when I say that. She would not leave me alone. She said, your wife had a pretty decent job, you want to be a homeowner, sure. And from that point on, she was calling me, it felt like every day, on my job, when I get home, asking for pieces of paper, documentation, make a copy, send it to me. But the next thing I know, probably in the span of probably 6 months, I had a home in DeSoto, a nice home. And I could not even tell you, I just know I'm signing papers and sending documentation. And so fast forward, it was sometime 20, 30 years ago, or 30 years ago, I'm at ICDC, and we're doing the exact same thing. To move people from being renters to homeowners, there's a person on my staff who does exactly what that woman from Acorn did for me. And it's interesting to see, part of it is heartbreaking that it takes that much. That in terms of the process, I'm not sure how far we've come, but it takes that much, and there has to be a supply of housing. And so, I'm glad for what everyone in the room does, because it's necessary, because I would not have been a homeowner, that soon, or at all. And so, it really takes me back.
Well, hello everyone. I'm really excited to be here, and I appreciate the question because I think it includes every single one of us here in the room. The housing ecosystem is one that we all reside in. Even those folks who at this time are unhoused, every single one of us has the answers because we have a unique experience with, yes, commonalities, but that's what it takes to have every single one of us here to have discussions, to see what are the pitfalls, what are the things that perhaps the market isn't addressing, what is the community doing on their own. So I'm really thrilled to be here, and that's why I start my journey in the ecosystem 30 years ago. I'm 30 years old. And because if it's one where, as you heard in the intro, is one where my parents came from a different country, but they had a landing spot because they had a family member that was renting a home in Oak Cliff. So it was one of those, well, yeah, it looks like a single family housing, but there's multiple families on that lot, right? So oftentimes, the data might say, oh, there's a percentage of single family housing in Dallas, which is true when you take the literal sense, but when you look at it on a cultural perspective, you see, oh, wait a minute, this single family housing unit has been built out, and then there's an ADU in the back on top of that that's illegal. And I say that from personal experience. I grew up in one for 7 years. It didn't have a kitchen, it didn't have a restroom, but it had a roof. We were able to have a heater, we were able to have an AC, and what brought me to become a planner was mostly because of the experience. Again, going back to our collective experience growing up, wherever you come from, we all have a housing experience that can lend a lot of expertise to move forward. And so I felt in the shadows living in the city of Dallas. We also didn't have a car. That was before biking was cool. I mean, now it's a thing, but back then people would look at you funny. And my father had a bike that would fold in half. So people would really give us double takes on the dark train and on the buses. And that's what lit the fire in me to become a planner, because there is it feels like an underground experience at times in the housing space where not everything you see is being talked about what's going on in the community. And so that's why and environmental justice. Because if you lose your job, that's going to affect your housing. If you live next to heavy industry, that's a fair housing issue. And so I'm excited to dive into the conversation today. But I encourage every single one of us, right? Like, what is their housing pathway? What is that experience? And find answers by having those conversations today.
Thank you. And I can't believe that he's telling me we have 15. Brian, how can we have 15 minutes? So it's going to be kind of quick, I think. I mean, you all talked about kind of the systemic aspect of housing. Homelessness is a housing issue. The value of transportation and living when you live in a community that you can walk. What are those transforming factors? The safety for your kids, your health, the cost of not having to be so, car dependent. The journey, the structure that actually allows you to get, who was that person in that structure, that system that allowed you to become a homeowner? And then obviously, Denver with your little experience, and those Mexicanos and that. I think that's the reason I decided to work in housing. I think it's the most direct way to affect equity for anyone, especially when you think about what it is that a homeowner gets that somebody that rents doesn't, right? So as you saw in my presentation, we try to, and especially in the Terwilliger Center, we try to think of ways of how do we connect things. So since we have a short amount of time, I would like us to be very succinct. What are 3 top barriers and 3 top opportunities that you see locally? I can start with you, Patrick.
Sure, happy to. For the 3 barriers, I would suggest one is sort of a broader paradigm shift that I think has to occur, where we consider the American dream, and I named my startup sort of after this, is that we generally think of the American dream as owning a 2-car garage and the single-family home, and the thought of that the single-family neighborhood is the ideal, it's the ideal for everybody, while losing the idea of the American dream, which what I believe it should be, is about upward mobility, and that we have to lower the barriers to entry into generational wealth that we can pass on, but also with the knowledge that for the most part, single-family development and low-density development does not pay for itself in terms of the tax revenue per acre and the cost of the infrastructure and services. That there's always going to be essentially a devalue of that property, or you're going to face assessments or reduced services or whatnot. So it just doesn't sustain itself. I think and I worry that there's a lack of will and capability of actually catalyzing new growth in existing neighborhoods in a way that is thoughtful and inclusive and equitable. And that's a challenge that we have to overcome. And lastly, I think there's also a local capacity, because the market and the delivery system of housing is geared either to the very large scale institutional investment developers versus sort of the small scale home builder fixer up. And we have to have a much more diverse home building delivery system, from design to finance to development, to having those pathways for apprentices to become contractors, contractors become general contractors, general contractors become developers and investors as well. So I think that's a barrier. that we have to overcome. Opportunities, I would say a new development code that the city is starting to work on now, which also could be handled as state legislation this coming legislative session. Public agency controlled land, so that's Dallas County, Dallas City, DART, which I'll talk about in a little bit, as well as DISD. So I live in Bishop Arts, where we have a Bishop Arts STEAM Academy elementary school that still has students in trailers. And this is for decades that they've had students in trailers. But this is valuable land where we could actually leverage that, working with the private sector, build new housing as for transitional housing in issues of displacement, as well as housing for teachers, nearby, and while getting a new school at the same time, rather than $1 billion bond for a couple new schools every 5-10 years. Lastly, potentially creating new land and driving more value into land by rethinking car-centric infrastructure. So we're not trying to make cars go fast and far, but actually think about infrastructure as a way where you can actually have more convenience by things being closer together.
So I think from the standpoint of the Dallas Housing Coalition and our work as it relates to the bond, the city bond here in Dallas, and the comprehensive land use plan, what I saw, what I heard and what I saw in City Hall chambers, the debate, it spoke clearly to me. And that is the biggest barrier really is our own attitude, collective attitude, toward who has the right to live. If I make, in my mind, this is how I think, if I make $500,000 a year in this city, I can live anywhere I want to. Nobody's going to tell me where. I can live pretty much anywhere I want. If I make less than 50, somebody gets to tell me where I have the right to live. And that's not right. I think if we change that attitude, I think many opportunities will open itself. The second thing I'll say is this. Austin is one of the models that we often look at. They're pretty progressive in terms of their approach to affordable housing. And I remember being at an event earlier this year, and I pulled one of them aside. I think they work for the city also. I said, okay, you all will be the last people I would expect to be so progressive in terms of your especially given where you are. And he said to me, it's because we recognize we are running out of land and we have no other choice than to be very creative. And so perhaps in Dallas, part of our problem is we have too much land. We don't have to be creative at this point. I'll stop there.
Very similar to what your number one was, which was mine, which is the opposition you see in the high opportunity neighborhoods that have been closed off, exclusionary, and zoning was a medium to accomplish that. That's a big barrier because that's what you heard the most coming out at City Hall during the Forward Dallas discussions. So that's barrier number one for me, what I see. And then as well, just thinking about the infrastructure or city, that does add cost in creating a development. Whether it's, it could be one of those that creates a development to become more expensive. And then third, what I've heard on the ground is just access to capital to preserve the naturally affordable housing that exists. That's underground again, but really crucial and important. Opportunities, contextualizing the conversation, the missing middle, it's become a word that when you say it, different people have different reactions to. So it's just like defining that a little bit better. And then two, supporting grassroots efforts going on right now to create affordable housing. And then when it comes to, I don't want this, I want that in my neighborhood, it's like, well, where's the fair housing conversation in that? So embedding that as a tool as you work for the city or you have your nonprofit or the banks, like that conversation needs to be included because I felt like it was missing a lot of times during the public hearings at City Hall when it pertained to Forward Dallas.
I think from the perspective of the homeless response system, there's about that 17% of the population of people experiencing homelessness on any given day are people who need a permanent subsidy and supportive services. So we call that permanent supportive housing. And our system analysis shows us that we need about 3,000 units of permanent supportive housing. And we will create access into units through a variety of means, but one channel is developing more permanent supportive housing. And we have not cracked the nut yet on how to make those deals attractive to developers. Other communities have, and I think we can look to lessons from other cities, but ultimately, these are complicated deals to put together. It requires not just a unit, but a permanent subsidy attached to that unit, as well as wraparound supportive services. And that means that you're coordinating resources across multiple systems, but you're also coordinating procurements across multiple systems and trying to package that in a way where it's delivered to the marketplace and developers actually want to participate in that project. So we are, I think, making some shifts locally on how we make those deals more attractive, but I think it's going to require, A, being able to identify those resources, and then being very coordinated with the entities who are bringing those resources to the table to be able to package them in a way that makes them attractive. So we're still working on that, but we're making progress.
And so, given the time we have, I just want to be mindful of all the people that are here as an opportunity. You all are opportunities, potential opportunities. So I think, Sarah, to your point, I mean, what are those partnerships that can be leveraged, right? I mean, in our report, we thought about this connect, leverage, and reform. And we can have a whole panel just of each of them and, maybe a whole day on how we would do that. But I think just given the audience that is here, what are those opportunities that you see locally, or what is that expertise or partnerships that you see elsewhere that you would like to be replicated locally, for each of you? So if we could start with you.
So when I think of partnership, the city. There are obviously, again, based on what we heard during the discussion around the bond and so forth, of whether or not the city of Dallas should be involved in affordable housing. There's some people who think, no, they shouldn't. That's impossible. And thankfully, even the city's Department of Equity and Inclusion has acknowledged, and even the city council has acknowledged, the city played a role in the inequity that we see. So therefore, it cannot excuse itself from making it right. So the city has to be a partner, and we have some good folk. So let me say that we have some really hard-working, honest folk in the city that are working to this end. I'm proud to work with them, but they need help. They can't do it by themselves. Outside City Hall walls, we're going to have more grassroots organizing that raises the voice, that holds elected officials accountable, so that the people in City Hall recognize the very data that she's talking about, so they can do their job. And so, to me, the community and the city.
Now, I'll give an example about focusing at the neighborhood level, what's going on there now. 10th Street is, if you're familiar, it's a historic district designated locally and also nationally, and it's a historical freedman town, one that is ground zero for displacement at this time. And this is a neighborhood that is truly taking the reins and try to preserve the community in the sense of when we saw in the past a lot of demolitions going on, new construction that was not affordable and also out of compliance of the historic integrity of the neighborhood. And what you see is that you have several residents today buying land. They're not doing it through banks, they're doing it through private investors within their network, right? Of, okay, I want to purchase this land to try to preserve, build, not just to historic compliance, but also to preserve and make sure that there is that voice, that control by the community to ensure that it's being able to remain in place. And one of the things I hear from them is that we need access to capital. That's what we need. And they say if you wait 90 days, a lot might go for sale tomorrow, and it's already bought within less than a week. And so it's thinking about how do we support the folks from the community who who are taking, they're playing the game of real estate. They're learning as they go, and they are, like developers, right? And so how do we make sure that we build that wealth within the community by and for them? And that's access to capital, and that includes all different types of partnerships, whether it's like cities, but also banks, private investors, you name it. There's already things going on right now, because similarly, they just cannot wait. Something has to give, and they're really pushing forward to try to do that. And what you just shared as well, opportunities of mobilizing communities, having neighborhood associations be created to be that unified voice to hold accountable all and everyone, that needs to, from the past to the future. So yeah, that's my biggest message, is just listening to what's going on the ground and supporting those efforts already. And they oftentimes, I'm always inspired that they have many ideas, but they just need those resources and to support, to establish them and to scale them up.
And I would just offer, I think one of the biggest lessons I've learned over the last 3 years is just the power of bringing everyone together around a common set of solutions, right? Because when we splinter and all come up with our own way of doing things, we never make progress. And so we have a lot of partners that are very interested in this issue right now, both in the philanthropic and business sectors, as well as obviously local governments. And I think we are going to make progress much quicker if we can all come together and prioritize what are the most important solutions that are going to drive progress in the community, and let's all encourage each other to invest in that unified strategy. And I think we've had a lot of progress on reducing homelessness over the last couple of years, and it all comes down to that, really. Just great partners coming together and agreeing on a unified approach. And I think Dallas Housing Coalition has been leading a lot on that strategy, and if we can all come together behind those solutions and align our resources, we're going to move a lot faster on this issue.
Well, I can speak to the potential partnership that I'm directly part of, which is Dallas Area Rapid Transit. So I'm on the board of directors of DART, where the chair of the board at my request created a new committee called the Development Committee that I chair, and that is focused on what to do with our land. And DART is sitting on 200 acres of surface parking lots at train stations and 100 acres of maintenance facilities and other various holdings and whatnot. And that therein is opportunity, because all too often public entities, agencies see land as a liability rather than an asset, and we're trying to change that to see it as an asset. And so we're looking at all of our land and what the potential of it could be. And so we've had a market value analysis done of our land. We're looking at all of our facility land to say, okay, what is the market value of that, and is it worth investing in it? Is it in the right location? Should we move off of it because it's tax exempt property that's not generating revenue for the city? It's also not rooftops over people's heads, right? And that's what we kind of want to help deliver, because we're sitting on all of that land. So as part of that market value analysis, we're adding in another layer of it to say, okay, what land is the most ripe to go to market to help deliver housing? What has needs to make it more ripe, and then what's probably not developable? So with the land that has needs, then working with our municipal partners to say, does it need better zoning? Does it need utility upgrades? We can actually help invest in some of that kind of stuff to make that land more viable for development, because if we can help deliver, let's say, 60 units per acre on those 200 acres of surface parking lots, it's 12,000 new housing units that we can help deliver. We can even write down the costs to help deliver mixed income, affordable housing on that too. And so if we're also delivering housing and density on cheaper transportation and make people's lives easier when you start adding in the cost of transportation with the cost of housing, that can be cheaper, then all of a sudden that's more revenue in people's pockets, but they're not spending on transportation and on car plans to get around too. So to me, that's a real opportunity, provided we have the right zoning in place to allow it.
Yeah, I think coming from the Washington D.C. area, we're not alone. A lot of different metro transit systems in the United States have realized that. It's just how you align all those things. And sometimes maybe you're lucky that you have a good share. There's a lot of stations that have a lot of fracture ownership, and it's really hard to coordinate that. So I think we're going to go into Q&A.
Yeah, can we do one more question? You have lots of good questions.
Well, I'm glad. That's great. And I hope you have some too. So we talked about partnership. I'm gonna say it, but what do we need to reform? I said, let's try to reconnect, what do we leverage? But the reform is always a hard, right? Because that requires all this other ecosystems to be aligned. But I think it's really important. And so is there, at the Terwilliger Center, what we see as a really good opportunity and a catalyst in a state like Florida is that they were able to pass the Live Local Act at the state level. And then that has repercussions for every single jurisdiction. I don't know if I'm like getting myself into trouble here, but I would think that there is something really important for that, and I'll be doing this if that's one of the things that as a national center we see. So putting out there certain coordination, what are the wins that they could be both at the state level and at the local level. They don't have to be, in not harmony. And with that, to your point, Jennifer, the notion of also when we think about the reform, what have you seen or what will be important to kind of start seeding as far as this typology? I have moved away from calling it missing middle. And I think the reason I have is because what does that mean to you? Missing middle, is the middle missing? If you're a kid, it means one thing. If you're, a 51-year-old woman, my middle is getting bigger. Like, what is? I want it to be missing, and it's not missing now. So, right? I'm trying to be funny, but in reality, what does that mean? You, and even all of us that work in housing may have a completely different idea of what it means. So I've tried to move more into housing typology, and different housing typologies. Then that gets us closer to density, and that can be another scary word, but at least we're saying it's not just single-family residential, right? So when we're thinking about reform, when we're thinking about what can we seed, because change only happens when we start seeding other things, other ways of looking at the reality that we have today, right? And on and on. Everybody that lives around missing middle, people that have walking infrastructure and people that can walk to different assets in their community, love it, right? But that's only able to happen because there's a diversity of housing co-located, right? So, so those two things, like what do we see, state, local, that could be kind of in alignment, Sarah, to your point about how do we row in that direction, and what do you guys see about reform that could be seeds of this housing typology expansion of ecosystem? And for all of you, whoever wants to start.
I think it's Jennifer's turn to start.
Yeah, I'm gonna try not to use missing middle. Housing typology. What's your housing type? Like your blood type, That's what it is. I'm the duplex, that's what I am.
But I aspire to be a fourplex.
I like a little card. Anyways, one thing that one of the fun things I like to do is have these type of conversations of what do we mean by housing. So this past summer, RAYO hosted a walking tour about Latino urbanism. I think that's the beauty about Dallas, is that there's so many different cultures, so much diversity, and that's how you get to making that bridge and connection. Because honestly, the Dallas City Code is missing a lot of those layers contextually, whether it's at the ethnic and racial and like cultural lens. So I'm looking forward to hopefully embedding some of that, because as I shared earlier, is in the Forward Dallas conversations, you kept hearing, we don't want missing middle, but it's already here. It's just not recognized and accepted per se by the code, and so it's one of those where I think about it more on the lateral right now, reform. So within neighborhoods and the city, in Forward Dallas, one of the recommendations of the housing section was having some type of incentive to have different housing types in communities, and making sure that incentive was available for low and moderate income families. I share that because there is that disconnection of what is missing middle. From what I hear community members, when you think of missing middle, they think the market version, which is the design, you can tell, it's something new, it stands out, but then also price-wise, it prices people out. So they're seeing something come in that, well, that's not for me, I can't afford it, and it doesn't align with what you see in our surrounding neighborhood. But then it's this informal underground that is more, there's a lot to be said there. It falls within the design standards, but you don't even know it's there, but it is. And so it's thinking about how can the city, right, be receptive to the folks who are taking the leadership in their own neighborhoods and saying, hey, like there's someone from the church who needs a place to stay, because that's what happened to us. Well, you can stay at our granny flat ADU. There's a lot of that already happening. So challenging the city of Dallas of like, okay, what can be done to support that informal network of support that already exists? And like I said, there's been some good things mentioned already. Also, I do want to uplift Builders of Hope as well for their anti-displacement toolkit, which you haven't checked it out, check it out.
I was thinking the same thing. Builders of Hope, the I think I saw Stephanie Champion somewhere in the back with the anti-displacement toolkit, and there are recommendations in there, state and local, and there are portions, if I'm not mistaken, that are included in the comprehensive land use policy. So when I think of reform, recommendations, things that could be, I think of that toolkit.
I might step into it here, but to reform something, I think we have to acknowledge that there's a problem and agree upon there being a problem and work towards a solution. And part of that is, I think, the term gentrification, which to me is a combination of investment and displacement. And to me, investment is generally a good thing, provided there's not displacement. And so if we can encourage investment, which a lot of our neighborhoods do need investment in, but then do so in a way where that growth is inclusive and we can position people to benefit from a rising tide, that's what we need to be doing. And so to me, I think that the need for reform is in neighborhood stabilization overlays that we use, because that then restricts heights, restricts density, whatnot, while being broadcast as this is something that's going to stop gentrification, which in practice, in reality, is an accelerator of it, because once capital investment finds that area, guess what happens? The prices are going to go up, everything gets scraped. Look no further than La Bajada in the West Dallas. And so to me, and I'm just going to introduce a concept here I've just started kicking around because of doing research on it, to turn it into a white paper and hopefully pitch to the city as a pilot program, is the Greek word anti-parochi, which is something that was a sort of grassroots solution to a housing problem in Athens, Greece, 100 years ago. And the term means mutual exchange. And what happens is the landowner, let's say it's a single family home, instead of selling the property to a developer, they get a couple of units in exchange, and the developer gets an incentive to say deliver 12 units or whatever it might be on there, and they get a couple of units, one to potentially live in, and then potentially passive income or have family members live in another one as well. And so I think if we can work out sort of that incentive program, whether it freezes the improvement assessment on taxes, and whether there's renters there on site, they get a unit, or if it's the homeowner on site, they get multiple units, whatever it might be. But I think there's something there, as long as we are not afraid of adding new housing and new density, but we find ways that people aren't being displaced. The quality of housing actually goes up, tax base goes up. Once density is higher, now you've got the potential to deliver amenities and new job opportunities and things closer in proximity to as part of a more complete neighborhood rather than a very sort of monoculture of a neighborhood. And I think that's something that I'd like to explore.
I mean, Brian doesn't think Sarah, will be really quick.
I'll be really quick. I mean, I'll just put in a plug. While we're reforming, there are people on the street today and people at the brink of homelessness in their homes who need a solution to being able to cover the gap between their income and their rent. And we can't wait until we have reform to solve that, or else we will be a community that sees big increases in homelessness. And so we have to both be reforming and think about what the future looks like and solve the problem right in front of us, which we can do. But that requires thinking about what sustainable resources do we have going to rental assistance. Those of you working in the prevention world have realized those resources are very scarce. and we need them for rehousing people once they become homeless. And we've proven that when we have those dollars, we can make the inflow each year or keeping people and preserving those housing placements, but it's going to require sustainable resources. And we need to look at where we can capture those resources. Is it through mainstream agencies? So, TANF funds can be used for rental assistance. Have we figured out how to target, agencies like TANF or our healthcare systems, as well as just general, some sort of revenue generating strategies to ensure that while we're solving this, we're actually holding at bay increases in homelessness as well.
Yeah, it's the moving train, and we need to